Skip the introductions, straight to the video.
In the middle of the 19th century, Moses Hess formulated the first written principles of communism. In 1862, Hess, or the communist rabbi as he was called, wrote the book Rome and Jerusalem, in which he laid the foundations for a Jewish nationalist movement called Zionism. In the book, he called on the Jewish people to become separatists and to prepare for the creation of a future homogeneous Jewish ethno-state.
What is being said here is half true. Yes, Moses Hess was a communist and an early advocate for the creation of Israel. However, he wasn't the first leading communist. At the same time, Karl Marx was writing his theories on how capitalism operated and suggested that the contradictions within the system would eventually result in its collapse, and a communist system would take its place, something which was missing from Hess's proposals. Also, the disagreements between Marx and Hess would intensify as the pair began to go different paths. In fact, in the 1840s, Hess remarks, regarding his relationship with Zionism, "It dawned on me for the first time in the midst of my socialist activities that I belonged to my unfortunate, slandered, despised and dispersed people." Therefore, it's safe to say that communism would play a minor role in Hess's life, and with that, in the development of the ideology.
Palestine would be occupied by the Jewish people, but the big problem was Palestine was at this time 90 to 95% Arab. Hess argued that the international Jewish bankers would help in this realization of stealing the land of the Palestinians. Hess suggested in his book that one last race and class struggle would be developed between the Aryans and the Semites. In this fight, Hess predicted that the Jews would stand as winners and the Aryans as losers.
The narrator misuses the term class struggle to refer to conflicts between two nationalities. This is not what class struggle is. Class struggle is purely a conflict between two economic classes, in this era being the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. A quote by Hess might recontextualize some things. "To be a race or a nation is not to desire racial or national mastery. It is a disease of nationalism to seek to dominate others. There are no superior and inferior races. All races must be made free, and only then they will cooperate as equals."
The Jews would stand superior over all other peoples. And because Jews had preserved their racial purity over the centuries, it would give them a leading role in the world. Hess essentially promoted eugenics and racial hygiene for the Jews, and talked about a future Jewish ethno-state. He also referred to Christianity as the religion of death.
Hess writes this in regards to history as a whole. "I still believe that Christianity was a step forward on the road towards the goal of humanity, which the Jewish prophets termed the Messianic Age. Today, more than ever, I still believe that the present great epoch in universal history had its great manifestation, at least in the history of the human spirit, in the teachings of Spinoza. However, I never believed, nor have I ever asserted, that Christianity is more than a mere episode in the sacred history of humanity." Instead of a derision of Christianity, as the quote on its own suggests, Hess is instead painting Christianity as an important step in history towards the Messianic Age, that being a mythical future period in which the Messiah will reign and bring peace and brotherhood to the world, supposedly.
Fascinatingly, he predicted a future war in Europe, with Germany, Italy, and Austria involved as a part of a race struggle. Moses Hess was also a close friend and collaborator of the two Jews, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, which he converted to communism and assisted them in their work with the Communist Manifesto in 1948.
Both Marx and Engels were staunch atheists, Marx once writing that religion is the opiate of the masses, when talking about how the ruling classes use it to exert control over the workers and to instill complacency. While yes, Hess convinced Engels to join the communist movement, Marx had at that time already begun advocating for the ideology. Also, Hess wasn't involved in the writing of the published pamphlet, the Communist Manifesto. He was commissioned to do so in 1847 by the Communist League, but the draft was rejected and Marx was instead given the task. Marx and Engels would split with Hess after a denouncement by the pair in the Communist Manifesto against him. Over time, Hess's involvement would become more and more irrelevant as the duo fleshed out the idea of communism.
This proves that socialism, Marxism, communism, and Zionism in fact share the same roots. Although they travel different paths, they have the same common goal: domination of the world.
The only man who had any sort of roots in all four of these ideologies is Moses Hess, and even then, his contributions became irrelevant as he left the movement so early in its creation. As well, Zionism has no connections with communism or Marxism beyond him. Zionism is a purely nationalist religious movement, and it does not concern itself with the political economy as Marxism does.
Both work and plan for the day when the chosen race shall inherit the earth. Karl Marx, real name Moses Mordecai Levy, was descended from a long line of famous rabbis who were so-called Talmudic scholars. Marx's grandfather was a rabbi by the name of Mordecai. In fact, his grandparents were related to the Jewish Rothschild family through marriage. Rothschild would also partially fund Karl Marx, who would be remembered as the Jewish father of communism.
I'm unsure of where he got the name Moses Mordecai Levy from. We know that Marx's father was a rabbi, and according to the Jewish Virtual Library, descended from a line of Talmudic scholars and rabbis. However, Marx would still end up rejecting this tradition once he began developing Marxism. And yes, according to the Jewish Journey, a passage through European history, Marx was related to a Rothschild, albeit 4 times removed. To put this into perspective, that means that they shared a great-great-great-grandparent, so it's unlikely that they had any contact or knowledge of each other's lineage. There's no evidence to suggest that any member of the Rothschild dynasty had given funds to Karl Marx.
Le Droit de Vivre, May 12, 1936, stated that Jewry is the mother of Marxism. The Communist Manifesto laid out the ideology of communism. Its key points include a central bank with monopoly on credit, abolition of countries and nationalities, abolition of the traditional family consisting of a man, a woman, and children, abolition of private property, which means no rights for the people, to make it impossible for people to earn a livelihood by introducing heavy taxation, confiscation of property, abolition of the right of inheritance, a communist state, a communist monopoly on credit and banking, the media in total control of the communists. Women should not focus on family and children anymore. In their own words, communism wants to do away with the status of women as mere instrument of production. Abolition of Christianity and morality. Marx refers to this totalitarian scheme as dictatorship of the proletariat.
Before debunking this section, I'd like to clarify 2 things. The first being that Marx somewhat disavowed these 10 points on the basis that they are no longer relevant after witnessing the rise and fall of the Paris Commune. Writing in the 1872 preface to the Communist Manifesto, no special stress is laid on the revolutionary measures proposed at the end of Section 2 in view of the practical experience gained. This program has in some details been antiquated. Secondly, he predicted that it would be the workers who would seize control of the state, and not the central bankers, as will be claimed later on. In the Communist Manifesto, he writes, "The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. of the proletariat organized as the ruling class. Therefore, it wouldn't be a communist monopoly on credit, it would be democratic control of credit, the media, etc., by the workers. Not that these are mutually exclusive. When Marx writes on private property, what he's actually referring to are the means of production, those being the means that the workers use to create goods, such as factories, farms, etc. Therefore, the true meaning of abolition of private property would be democratic ownership over factories, farms, shops, etc. by the workers. Regarding the abolition of countries and nationalities, Marx doesn't as much call for the abolition so much as he predicts their disillusionment. He writes, "The working men have no country. We cannot take from them what they have not got, since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise to be the leading class of the nation, must constitute itself the nation." He elaborates, "National differences and antagonisms between people are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie. The supremacy of the proletariat will cause them to vanish still faster in proportion as the exploitation of one individual by another is put an end to. The exploitation of one nation by another will also be put an end to. As the antagonism between classes disappear, so too will the hostility of one nation to another." Europa's definition of a traditional family as consisting of a man and a woman supporting their children is incorrect. This sort of family unit is called the nuclear family and had only achieved mass adoption after the 1950s in the West. However, during the time in which the manifesto was written, the rich had the wealth needed to maintain such a unit. That is what Marx is wishing to abolish, believing that it deprives individuals of the ability to seek love, or replacing it with a need to pursue financial stability. As been said earlier, Marx wanted to do away with all religion. Finally, regarding Marx's supposed wish to make it impossible to earn a living, he didn't. He wanted to strip the rich of their wealth, which he believed had already been stolen from the workers through the system of wage labour.
His cult followers promote violence, class envy, hostility towards free markets, family, business, tradition, and Christianity. Today, they are instrumental in the destabilization of Europe.
Marxists are opposed to capitalism and wish to advance beyond traditional norms such as religion and the nuclear family. Contrary to popular belief, capitalism is not defined by the presence of a free market, for if it were, it would have ended centuries ago with the abolition of the slave trade.
Marx also openly encouraged genocide against Slavs, referring to them as racial trash and that they must perish in a revolutionary Holocaust.
This is a lie. Marx did not advocate for a genocide of the Slavs, nor did he coin the term revolutionary Holocaust to describe this wish. The original goes as follows: "Society is undergoing a silent revolution. The classes and the races, too weak to master the new conditions of life, must give way. But can there be anything more puerile, more short-sighted than the views of those economists who believe in all earnest that this woeful transitory state means nothing but adapting society to the acquisitive propensities of capitalists, both landlords and money lords?"
In his 1920 article, Zionism versus Bolshevism, a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people, Winston Churchill stated his belief that international Jews were seeking a worldwide communist state under Jewish domination. The international Jews would use communism and Zionism to accomplish this. As a first step towards establishing Israel, Hezekiah Niles described in Niles' Weekly Register article that the Rothschilds had purchased Jerusalem in 1829.
The only evidence I could find of this happening is in the same article shown on the screen. Given the land was at the time controlled by the Muslim-dominated Ottoman Empire, such a purchase probably would have made bigger headlines. However, a member of the dynasty, Baron Edmund James de Rothschild, had purchased around 2% of the land, which makes up Israel near the end of the 19th century, not Jerusalem.
In 1897, the first Zionist Congress was held in Basel, Switzerland, and was chaired by Theodor Herzl. Jewish delegates from across Europe agreed that Palestine should be given to them. Prior to his death in 1904, Herzl predicted that a world body will one day give Palestine to the Jews, and that he will go down in history as the father of the Jewish state. For Herzl's dream to come true, European military powers would have to be manipulated and used into taking Palestine away from the Ottomans by force. In the German newspaper Deutsche Zeitung, Herzl wrote, "The wealthy Jews rule the world. The fate of the governments lies in their hands. They start wars between countries, and when they wish, the governments make peace. When the wealthy Jews sing, the nations and their leaders dance along. And meanwhile, the Jews get richer."
Yes, Herzl said this, but similar to Churchill, that doesn't make it true. It is also important to remember Theodor was prone to changing his views depending on the situation. For example, he once advocated for the conversion of Jews to Christianity in order to avoid persecution, before abandoning the idea once the Zionist movement began to grow. The narrator portrays Herzl's actions as malicious and deceptive. However, he made it explicit that he wished for the creation of Israel to be beneficial for both the Jewish people, the Western powers, and the Ottoman Empire. "Palestine is our ever-memorable historic home. The very name of Palestine would attract our people with a force of marvellous potency. If His Majesty the Sultan were to give us Palestine, we could, in return, undertake to regulate the whole finances of Turkey. We should there form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. We should, as a neutral state, remain in contact with all Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence."
Communism was devoted to abolish private property in order to concentrate all wealth and power in the hands of the global central banking cabal.
As been stated before in part 1, private property, as Marx defines them, are the means of production, which under communism would be in the hands of the workers, not the central banks.
Around 250 years ago, in 1760, Mayor Amschel Rothschild created the House of Rothschild that paved the way for international banking and control of the world's resources.
Meyer Amschel Bauer, born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1744, was a moneylender and a goldsmith on Jew Street, whose shop had a sign out front with a red hexagram on it. Eventually, he would change his name to Rothschild, which is German for red sign. Rothschild soon learned that loaning money to governments and kings was more profitable than loaning money to private individuals. Not only were the loans bigger, but they were secured by the nation's taxes.
I couldn't find any evidence for this, but as always, if you do know, leave a comment, and if it is important enough, I'll re-upload the video with the mistake corrected.
Meyer Rothschild had 5 sons whom he trained in the skills of money creation and sent out to the major capitals of Europe to open branches of the family banking business.
Just how rich and powerful is Lord Evelyn Rothschild? Historically, the Rothschild family wealth was hidden in underground vaults. The Rothschild secret financial records were never audited and never accounted for. Their family commissioned biographies give the illusion that their family fortune has dwindled, but researchers estimate their wealth at close to $500 trillion, more than half the wealth of the entire world. The Rothschilds bought Reuters in the 1800s. Reuters then bought the Associated Press, which selects and delivers the same news stories to the entire world, day after day. They have controlling interest in 3 major television networks and easily avoid media attention since they own it.
Well, recently, a few companies owned by members of the Rothschilds have been audited. The Rothschilds never bought Reuters. Today, it is trading under the Thomson Reuters Corporation. The breakdown of holders will be in the description. There's no record of Reuters buying out the Associated Press either, nor of the Rothschilds holding stock in it. Rothschild & Co., the main investment firm of the dynasty, released a report in 2021 disclosing their holdings, and neither of the aforementioned companies appeared.
Until recently, they owned and operated England's Royal Mint and continue to be the gold agent for the Bank of England, which they also direct. They control the LBMA, London Bullion Market Association, where 30 to 42 million ounces of gold worth over $11 billion are traded daily. The Rothschilds earn millions weekly just on transaction fees alone. They also fix the world price of gold on a daily basis and profit from its ups and downs.
They were once head of the organization N.M. Rothschild & Sons, the institution once responsible for the fixing of gold, withdrew from the position in 2004, along with the trading of gold. After this, the system of chairmanship was changed to one where the role would rotate between members of the conference annually.
Over the centuries, the Rothschilds have amassed trillions of dollars worth of gold bullion in their subterranean vaults and have cornered the world's gold supply. They own controlling interest in the world's largest oil company, Royal Dutch Shell. They operate phony charities and offshore banking services where the wealth of the black nobility and the Vatican is hidden in secret accounts at Rothschild Swiss banks, trusts, and holding companies. Although Evelyn Rothschild looks like a harmless gray-haired old man, make no mistake about it, Rothschild and his ancestors have handpicked presidents, crashed stock markets, bankrupted nations, orchestrated wars, and sponsored the mass murder and impoverishment of millions.
I couldn't find evidence the Rothschilds have been responsible for any wars. Personally, I wouldn't be surprised if they contributed to overall poverty in the world, given the somewhat exploitative nature of banks, especially in regards to third world nations.
The wealth hoarded by this one family alone could feed, clothe, and shelter every human being on earth.
The Rothschilds is the head of the snake. Within the city of London, there is a 1 mile square that is referred to as the City. This is the headquarters of the Jewish family Rothschild's banking dynasty that owns the money supply through the central banks of almost every nation on earth.
Online, there are countless lists that allege the central banks of nearly every country on the planet are owned by the Rothschilds. Unfortunately, I couldn't find out how they came to this conclusion.
In November 1910, 7 of the world's richest Jewish men held a secret meeting on Jekyll Island just off the coast of Georgia to establish a central bank, which they called the Federal Reserve Bank. These men were Nelson Aldrich and Frank Vanderlip, both representing the Rockefeller financial empire, Henry Davison, Charles Norton, and Benjamin Strong, representing J.P. Morgan, and Paul Warburg, representing the Rothschild banking dynasty of Europe. There were some powerful men who made it abundantly clear that they were not in favor of the Federal Reserve System. Their total wealth today would be worth nearly $11 billion. These were Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, and Jacob Astor. Unfortunately, all of them were on board Titanic when it sank to the depths of the sea. All 3 died that night. By April 1912, all opposition to the Federal Reserve had been eliminated. On December 23, 1913, after many senators and congressmen had left town for Christmas, the President Wilson signed a bill, and the privately owned Federal Reserve System came into being in the United States. After Woodrow Wilson had signed the Federal Reserve Act, which gave private interests control over economic power in 1913, he said,
"I'm the most unhappy man. I've unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and endurance of a small group of dominant men."
The majority of the men who met at Jekyll Island weren't Jewish, and the plan that they put together, the Aldrich Plan, failed in Congress. The Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913, but with substantial changes to the original act, such as adding a decentralized structure, which would require a majority of each major Federal Reserve Bank to be in agreement of the decision for it to be implemented. The power of each individual branch was so limited, in fact, that at the beginning of the Great Depression, the New York Fed generated controversy by injecting millions into the stock market, since it hadn't consulted with the other branches. To frame the bank as completely private would be misleading. In the end, Congress had the power to give and take responsibilities to and from the Fed. The quote from Woodrow Wilson is unsubstantiated.
Jewish bankers and their rabbis actually celebrated the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. After the Federal Reserve was up and running, Charles August Lindbergh added, "The financial system has been turned over to the Federal Reserve Board. The system is private, conducted for the sole purpose of obtaining the greatest possible profits for the use of other people's money." The Federal Reserve System was neither federal, nor does it contain reserves, and nor is it a part of a decentralized system. The adoption of the debt-based financial system preached by Marx in the Communist Manifesto had been accomplished. The current banking system, fractional reserve banking, enables privately owned banks to create money out of thin air. Money today is simply numbers in a computer system, with only about 3% existing as physical currency. Through its control and monopoly of our money, the elite that own the Federal Reserve now have total control over other banks, corporations, money, and politicians. The Fed system is designed to enslave us to never-ending debt and to fool us to believe that our money has any real value, when it is in fact worthless, created out of thin air, based on debt, and backed by nothing.
For decades, by statute, every $100 in Federal Reserve notes had to be backed by at least $40 in gold, and the rest by prime commercial bills, which were used to finance trade. The system of decentralization ended in 1935, transitioning to a system where a board would oversee the branches. This occurred because the Fed was unable to take decisive action to mitigate the effects of the Great Depression.
It must enslave humanity to protect its monopoly over credit. Its money-creating tricks enabled Big Brother government to borrow endless money from the Fed. The Fed were now controlled by the Jews Rothschild, Warburg, and Schiff. Every Federal Reserve chairman since 1980 has been Jewish: Burns, Volcker, Greenspan, Bernanke, and Yellen. The House of Rothschild owns 57% of the stock of the privately held Federal Reserve Bank.
Not anymore, since current chair Jerome Powell is a Catholic. Member banks in the Federal Reserve System do hold stock in the institution, but given the size of Rothschild-held firms today compared to its contemporaries, I doubt it's 57%. It's also worthwhile to mention that member banks can't sell their stock, nor use it as collateral for loans.
The Jew Harold Wallace Rosenthal explained, "Our power has been created through the manipulation of the national monetary system. The Federal Reserve System fitted our plan nicely since it is owned by us, but the name implies that it's a government institution. From the very outset, our purpose was to confiscate all the gold and silver, replacing them with worthless, non-redeemable paper notes. We, Jews, have put issue upon issue to the American people. Then we promote both sides of the issue as confusion reigns. With their eyes fixed on the issue, they fail to see who is behind every scene. We Jews glory in the fact that the stupid Goy have never realized that we are the parasites, consuming an increasing portion of production, while the producers are continually receiving less and less."
The validity of this manuscript the quote comes from is contested. My 2 cents is that it's been fabricated, given how in-your-face the language is, and how it plays into, at this point, debunks conspiracy theories, such as Jewish Bolshevism. Now I wonder why the reporter would wait 2 years after Rosenthal died to publish it.
According to the State Department's documents, a group of Jews, including Jacob Schiff, Felix Warburg, Otto Kahn, Mortimer Schiff, Isaac Seligman, already planned the overthrow of the Russian Tsar in 1916. They decided that Russia should be destroyed and a communist slave regime would be implemented.
Jacob Schiff and many other Jews resented the Tsarist regime for its anti-Semitic laws, such as the May laws, which prohibited all but a few Jews from settling outside these boundaries. As well as this, Nicholas II refused to crack down on the widespread pogroms that were being held against the Jewish population. From 1903 to 1906, over 2,000 Jews were killed in a series of pogroms, which was followed by the emigration of over 2 million from the country. Due to the inaction of Tsar Nicholas, many Jews grew resentful of the regime, with some turning to more radical ideologies. This state-sanctioned anti-Semitism would be bonded in the minds of many within the Russian Tsardom. Jacob Schiff, however, didn't lend his support to the Bolsheviks. Instead, he funded reformists such as Alexander Kerensky. The Bolsheviks, in fact, only played a supporting role in the February Revolution, which forced the abdication of the Tsar.
By Jewish Bolsheviks as Vladimir Lenin, Trotsky, Kaganovich, Yagoda. The family of Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, his daughters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and his son and successor Alexei were devout Orthodox Christians. As a boy, Tsar Nicholas II had witnessed the assassination of the Tsar Alexander II by the Jewish terrorist Vera Figner, leader of a terrorist group called the People's Will. Tensions between the Jews and the Christian Russians started. Nicholas' great tragic mistake was in failing to execute the communists before it was too late after a failed 1905 revolution. Now, his kindness would return to haunt him and his family. The Bolsheviks forced the Tsar to abdicate. The Jew Alexander Kerensky was given $1 million from the Jewish Wall Street banker Jacob Schiff to immediately free all political prisoners and lift the ban on political exiles to permit them to return to Russia. Revolutionaries quickly flooded into any and all public offices. Anarchy began as criminals plundered houses and people were murdered and robbed.
There's no evidence that Kerensky was paid to launch the amnesties in 1917. The post-revolutionary chaos can be attributed to the worsening food situation due to the war and the breakdown of supply chains.
Jacob Schiff was chairman of the Kula Bank and an assistant of the Jewish Rothschilds. He took care of the contacts between the revolutionary movement in Russia and the Jewish Masonic order B'nai B'rith. On March 27, 1917, the Jews Jacob Schiff and Max Warburg sent Lev Davido Bronstein, better known as Trotsky, and his group of Jewish communists off to Russia to lead a Jewish revolution with no less than $20 million in gold.
Trotsky was in New York thanks to his internal deportation to and subsequent escape from Siberia in 1907. There's no evidence that he was funded by Jacob Schiff.
Some 90,000 exiles, mostly Jews and Freemasons, returned from all over the world to infiltrate Russia. Most of them changed their Jewish names to blend into the European society better. Trotsky recruited Russian Jews from the immigrant population of the Lower East Side of Manhattan and trained them as armed revolutionaries. Lenin, Marlow, Radek, and Kamenev returned from Switzerland. Stalin, Sverdlov, and Simonyev returned from Siberia. The Jewish chairman of the Central Executive Committee, Jacob Sverdlov, sent a message to the Jew Jacob Jurovsky, head of the Loka Cheka, where he communicated that he had received orders from Jacob Schiff to eliminate the Tsar and his entire family.
The Tsar and his family were moved from place to place during the Revolutionary and Civil War period, with the intent on eventually trying them for the crimes of the former regime. Those guarding the house had been given permission beforehand to kill them at their discretion. The Civil War delayed the trial, and as the White Army threatened to take the province the Tsar's family was kept in, it was decided by the guards to put the family down.
News of the brutal murder of the Romanovs would send shockwaves throughout Russia and all of Europe. To some Jews, though, the slaughter of the Romanov family was treasured as a Jewish ritual murder. In selected Jewish-owned shops, they sold greeting cards with images that were unavailable for Gentiles. The postcards carried the image of the Tzaddik. This is an image of a rabbinical Jew with the Torah in his hand and a white foal in the other. The head of the depicted foal is clearly shown to be the Imperial Russian Tsar Nicholas II. Below this image is the inscription in Hebrew. This is a sacrificial animal, so is my cleansing. It will be my replacement in cleansing the victim.
I highly doubt that the murder of the Tsar and his family was a Jewish ritual killing. Firstly, the postcard that is on screen dates back to 1910, before the revolution. Secondly, I couldn't find evidence that it was even made in Russia. But besides that, remember that communism is an atheistic movement.
A bloody civil war between the Red Jews, led by Trotsky, and the White Christians, led by Admiral Kolchak, broke out before the Jews could grab full power of the Soviet powerhouse to set up their own Bolshevik totalitarian system. David R. Francis, US ambassador to Russia, said in January 1918, "The Bolshevik leaders here in Russia, most of whom are Jews and 90% of whom are returned exiles, care little for Russia or any other country, but are internationalists, and they're trying to start a worldwide social revolution."
I couldn't find the quote being attributed to him besides the Sci-Funny post.
The Jewish role in the Communist Revolution was mentioned in many major Jewish publications, such as the Jewish Encyclopedia and the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia and the Encyclopaedia Judaica. In fact, they are boasting about the essential role of the Jews in the Russian Revolution. The Jewish Chronicle said, "There is much in the fact of Bolshevism itself, in the fact that so many Jews are Bolshevists, in the fact that the ideals of Bolshevism at many points are consonant with the finest ideals of Judaism."
The creator cut the quote short and left out some important context. The remaining quote goes as follows: "Some of which went to form the basis of the best teachings of the founder of Christianity." Section 1. The menace of Bolshevism is manifest. It pulls down what, until now, it has shown itself unable efficiently to replace. In the name of freedom, it imposes galling slavery. In the name of humanity, it inflicts the direst evil upon the men who come under its sway. It protests against class domination, and itself imposes the domination of class wherever it obtained power. It is a social disaster. The full article will be in the description and pinned comment for you to read.
Of the 22 ministers in the first Soviet government, 17 were Jews. The few who were not themselves Jewish often were Freemasons, had Jewish wives, and spoke Yiddish.
Regarding the first revolutionary government, there is no consensus on the ethnic or religious composition. However, we do know the composition of the Central Committee of the Bolsheviks on the eve of the revolution. Out of the 30 members, 6 were Jewish.
We can't know for sure if Stalin was Jewish, but at least he spoke Yiddish and had 3 Jewish wives.
Stalin only had 2 wives, and only one of them was Jewish.
Some historians claim that Stalin was Georgian, and some say that he was a Georgian Jew. Los Angeles B'nai B'rith Messenger, for example, stated that Stalin was a Jew.
There's no evidence pointing to the idea that Stalin was Jewish.
Stalin's real name was Losif Vissarionovich Djugashvili. The Jewish writer Moritz Steinschneider invented the term anti-Semitic in 1860. The term would be used to silence all those that dared to expose Jewish crimes. Because of the predominantly Jewish character of the regime, the very first piece of legislation approved by the communist regime was the Anti-Semitism Act in 1917.
We don't know if this was the very first act, but nonetheless, the Bolsheviks frowned on anti-Semitism since it was a link to the past regime. Anti-communists weren't automatically deemed to be anti-Semites.
Communist was regarded as an anti-Semite. Leon Trotsky also started using the word racist to browbeat all dissenters of the communist ideology and to render debate impossible.
There's no evidence to suggest that Trotsky used the term racist to win debates.
These words are used still to this day to bully any politically incorrect person into silence. Even more now than ever, they're trying to make it punishable to question or criticize their actions by calling it hate speech, fake news, or anti-Semitic. You must understand, the leading Bolsheviks who took over Russia.
The next minute is just a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It is on the screen now if you want to pause and read it.
the Jewish Bolsheviks implemented a policy known as collectivization. By collectivization, they could take away the peasants' land in the name of the state. This was what Marx himself described as the essence of communism, to abolish private property. In early 1930, over 91% of the agricultural land was collectivized. The communists were taking every good from the peasants. All weapons of the civilians were also confiscated by the state.
Many peasants actually lived in communes, where the land was owned by the community. The peasants would contribute to the community, and the commune would pay taxes to the government.
He ordered NKVD to confiscate all grain, all food from these areas. By doing that, he knew he's condemning them to
картошку, свеклу, капусту, соленая капуста в бочке, с бочкою. Куда забираешь? Садить же нужно. Нужно посадочку, никто не собрать, и все.
What is being described here is a system called war communism, implemented by Lenin to ensure that the Red Army would be well fed and to stave off a mass starvation of the cities. It was less ideologically motivated than the documentary claims, and more so to maintain a semblance of order in a Russia on the brink of collapse. Conditions were worsened by the Civil War and subsequent intervention of the United States, France, Britain, Japan, Czechoslovakia, amongst others, against the new government, sending a force of 200,000 to fight the Soviets. Between the start of the First World War and 1921, grain production went down by half, and gross output of all industry by 2/3. A breakdown was inevitable, and such events had occurred before, and under less dire circumstances, such as in the 1891 famine, resulting in 400,000 deaths.
During the periods of 1921 to 1922, 1932 to 1933, and 1946 to 1947, the Jewish Bolshevik regime deliberately mechanized 3 series of genocidal man-made famines aimed at starving farmers in Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Russia. Millions died a slow death, and people resorted to eating grass, and some even to cannibalism. This real Holocaust is today referred to as the Holodomor. Encyclopedia Britannica estimates around 8 million people, 5 million of them Ukrainian, were starved to death by the Stalin-Kaganovich famine alone, and the 3 Holodomor genocides together resulted in a death toll of 16.5 million. Russian historian Alexander Solzhenitsyn estimated that between 1917 to 1958, the Jewish Bolshevik regime managed to exterminate up towards 60 million Europeans, including victims of the forced collectivization, the hunger, large purges, expulsions, banishment, executions, and mass deaths at gulags.
There's no evidence that 60 million people died in this period. I'm not sure how whoever came up with that figure came to this conclusion, but to give you something to compare it to, Robert Conquest, a devout anti-communist, believed that 20 million were killed during Stalin's reign, which was also far off from the truth.
Industrial scale murders like these are an essential part of communist theory. With these famines, Lenin, Stalin, Kaganovich, and all their Jewish agents destroyed any remaining resistance to the communists. An order from Lenin and Trotsky, the Red Terror was first announced by the Jew Jacob Sverdlov. Lenin stipulated that 3 quarters
of mankind may die, if necessary, to ensure the other quarter for communism. Lenin even outlined the purpose for the famines by stating, destroying the peasant economy and driving the peasant from the country to the town. The famine creates a proletariat. Lenin also regarded Europeans as animals. It is precisely now, and only now, when in the starving regions people are eating human flesh, and hundreds if not thousands of corpses are littering the roads, that we can, and therefore must, carry out the confiscation of church valuables with the most savage and merciless energy, not stopping short of crushing any resistance. He continued. The greater the number of representatives of the reactionary clergy and reactionary bourgeoisie we succeed in executing for this reason, the better.
These quotes are attributed to Lenin on many websites. Unfortunately, none of them provide an actual source.
Leon Trotsky said,
We must turn Russia into a desert populated by white Negroes, upon whom we shall impose a tyranny, such as the most terrible Eastern despots never dreamt of. The only difference is that this will be a left-wing tyranny, not a right-wing tyranny. It will be a red tyranny, and not a white one. We mean the word red, literally, because we shall shed such floods of blood as we will make all the human losses suffered in the capitalist wars pale by comparison. The biggest bankers across the ocean will work in the closest possible contact with us. If we win the revolution, we shall establish the power of Zionism upon the wreckage of the revolution's funeral, and we shall become a power before which the whole world will sink to its knees. We shall know what real power is, by means of terror and bloodbaths. We shall reduce the Russian intelligentsia to a state of complete stupefaction and idiocy, into an animal existence.
This was printed by Nashput, a newspaper owned by the Russian Fascist Party. Supposedly, Trotsky confided with Rasputin's secretary about a future communist revolution funded by American capitalists who wanted to take over Russia to strengthen Zionism while simultaneously depopulating it. Whether or not you think he actually said that is up to you.
mass arrests in the middle of the night, kidnapping, executions, and brutal tactics of torture took place. The communist plan was to use psychological warfare, torture, and terror to intimidate their white enemies into submission. Gendrich Yagoda was a Jewish secret police official who served as the director of the NKVD. A major Israeli publication, Ynet News, revealed the truth about Yagoda, saying, "We must not forget that some of the greatest mass murders of all time were Jewish." It goes on, Gendrich Yagoda was the greatest Jewish murderer of the 20th century. He is responsible for the deaths of at least 10 million people. The Jewish Checkout was a secret police force created through the NKVD, later KGB, on December 20, 1917.
Nowhere near 10 million were put to death by Yagoda. He served as second deputy to Felix Dzerzhinsky, head of the Cheka, and only obtained a lead role in 1934 as head of the NKVD, the same year that it was created. During the Great Purge, 700,000 were killed. The death toll of the Cheka ranges from 30,000 to 140,000. The gulags from 1921 to 53, 2 million. So, where did this inflated figure come from? Ultimately, it's because of the secretive nature of the Soviet state. In the absence of publicly available records, historians and statisticians resorted to what was essentially guesswork combined with testimonies from people such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who also had no access to internal documents.
By the Jew Felix Dzerzhinsky. Jews made up nearly 80% of the rank and file Cheka agents, reports Bruce Lincoln, an American professor of Russian history. The Cheka run.
The next minute or so describes the torture methods used by the Cheka, which the descriptions and imagery are incredibly explicit and might get the video taken down. As far as I know, it's true, and its barbarity was only rivaled by the anti-communist White Terror carried out prior to and during the Civil War.
Lazar Kaganovich was the Jewish head of the KGB and was well known for his purges of those who opposed Jewish control. It is argued that Stalin, whose second wife was Kaganovich's sister, was a mere figurehead. Some believe that the numerous Jews below Stalin in all significant positions ran the show.
Stalin didn't purge those who were opposed to Jewish control. In fact, some high-ranking Jews fell victim to his purges, such as Zinoviev. He even ordered the assassination of Trotsky in 1940. Based off of this, it's safe to say that Stalin didn't give preferential treatment to those suspected of conspiring against him.
As proof, some point out that many of the churches were burnt to the ground, while the synagogues were left standing. Many priests were forced to sweep the streets and others were murdered. The Jewish Soviet leaders held rabbis in high esteem, and those people who dared to criticize the Jewish supremacy were mercilessly murdered as anti-Semitism became a crime punishable by death in the Soviet Union.
The anti-Christian action occurred earlier in the Soviet Union's history. After this initial fervor wore off, the regime began a period of religious tolerance, as many Orthodox churches were allowed to reopen across the country.
The Jew Kaganovich ordered the deaths of millions and the total destruction of Christian monuments and churches. Among these victims were bishops, professors, doctors, policemen, officers, lawyers, civil servants, journalists, writers, artists, nurses, workers, and farmers. The most intelligent and the highest achieving segment of the population was totally wiped out, which left a population of ignorant workers, peasants, and a powerful Jewish ruling elite.
It wasn't really a population of ignorant workers. Literacy rates prior to the revolution were below 50%. In 1950, they were near 100%. Primary education was near universal by the 30s, and affirmative action programs were introduced to uplift the poor.
Lenin said, "We must hate. Hatred is the basis of communism. Children must be taught to hate their parents if they're not communists."
I could only find this being attributed to Lenin in this paper, which cites its source as defeat of one's own government in imperialist war, but when I read it, I found no mention.
From the American Hebrew of September 8, 1920. The Bolshevik revolution in Russia was the work of Jewish brains, of Jewish dissatisfaction, of Jewish planning, whose goal is to create a new order in the world. What was performed in so excellent a way in Russia, thanks to Jewish brains, and because of Jewish dissatisfaction, and by Jewish planning, shall also through the same Jewish mental and physical forces become a reality all over the world.
I couldn't find a paper from the American Hebrew dated 8th of September 1920, but I did find one from the 10th. Other articles allege that's extracted from the latter. Now I couldn't access it because the website that's archived on, the New York Public Library, requires a library card from the state. But if anyone watching does live in New York and has a library card, the link to it will be in the description and pinned comment.
A righteous Jew, Henry H. Klein, explained that Zionism is a political program for the conquest of the world. Zionism destroyed Russia by violence as a warning to other nations. It is destroying the United States through bankruptcy, as Lenin advised. Zionism wants another world war if necessary to enslave the people. Our manpower is scattered over the world. Will we be destroyed from within, or will we wake up in time to prevent it?
Henry Klein said and believed this. He also believed that the protocols of the learned elders of Zion were a legitimate minutes of a Jewish meeting.
The Rabbi Stephen Samuel Wise in New York said, "Some called it communism, but I call it Judaism."
I couldn't find the source of the quote, but as always, if you know where to find it, leave a comment linking to it. I have them enabled, by the way.
Stalin even got to the point of killing people by random, by quotas.
Let's say 100,000 in Tambov district. Okay, that's it. Whoever they grabbed and shot will be fulfilling quota. They wouldn't care about names. Then after the quotas were fulfilled, the local authorities would report to Stalin, to Central Committee, and asked for additional quotas.
They weren't really quotas. There were limits on how many could be either killed or imprisoned and could be raised, which was incredibly easy to do. That, combined with the fervour of the Great Purge, created a sort of competition between the districts. This perverse incentive would lead to some picking names out of random phone books, but this was limited in scale and was not state-sanctioned.
Хрущев просил лимит, вот, значит, там, что-то ему там разрешалось, что-то 7 или 8 тысяч врагов народа. Он просил, дайте мне лимит на 17 тысяч.
An additional quota will be given, and after fulfilling, they would again ask for additional quota, and so it will go in circles. It was like mincemeat machine, you know. It was just killing and killing and killing.
Sometimes the Jewish butchers cut open the stomachs of their victims, pulled out a length of small intestine, nailed it to a telegraph pole, and with the whip forced the victim to run circles around the pole until the whole intestine became unraveled and the victim died. The Bolsheviks would eliminate every free thinker. Trotsky wanted every individual to be a rootless soldier of labor, and he thought that all those demanding free speech, free press, and free trade unions should be shot like dogs.
Trotsky never publicly nor privately demanded the deaths of anyone who wanted free speech. Free speech has always been one of the first rights to disappear during times of conflict, such as in the First World War. This censorship extended to Tsarist Russia as well. Editors of newspapers were arrested, issues were seized, and companies shut down.
If ordered to move, they were forced to obey. If they refused, they were deserters who would be punished with death. Every move was at gunpoint. Trotsky often executed his victims personally in the most cruelest ways. He happily ordered disciplinary executions, and he even ordered children murdered. Officers and their families were executed for disobeying orders. The Jew Grigory Zinoviev, real name Hirsch Apfelbaum, as head of the Communist International, wrote in an article in the Draznaya Gazeta in Moscow, September 1st, 1918. "We will make our hearts cruel, hard, and immovable, so that no mercy will enter them, so that they will not quiver at the sight of a sea of enemy blood. We will let loose the floodgates of that sea. Without mercy, without sparing, we will kill our enemies in scores of hundreds. Let them be thousands. Let them drown themselves in their own blood. Let there be floods of blood of the bourgeoisie. More blood, as much as possible." Every people who dared to criticize the regime would be branded as anti-Semitic and punished with death. Christians, priests, and the most attractive youth, and all non-Jewish intellectuals were the first to be exterminated. In years to come, Stalin's crime against humanity would make Lenin's Red Terror crumble in comparison. The Gulag was the Jewish NKVD system of forced labor and extermination camps. Any person suspected of disagreeing with the Jewish Bolshevik government was kidnapped by the Jewish secret police and deported to a Gulag.
This part covers the Nazino Island tragedy. It's essentially a summary, and most of it is true, except for this bit. Trotsky, at the time of the deportation of prisoners to Nazino, had already been exiled from the USSR. Also, I couldn't find a source for the quote. The gulags weren't a system of death camps, and yes, Jews made up 11 out of 12 commandants of the major camps, but for all the work that has been done painting Jews as the rulers of the Soviet Union, amongst others, many important facts have been left out, such as how by 1939, the percentage of Jews in high-ranking NKVD positions had fallen to around 5%, lower than that of the Georgians, as well as Stalin's purging of Jews and his post-war anti-cosmopolitan campaign. Or by the time of Stalin's death, only one Jewish man remained in his Politburo, Lazar Kaganovich.
Ironically, communism, aka the workers' paradise, was pretty much the opposite. The policy hurt every worker and benefited only the communists in high power. Everyone who opposed Stalin's collectivization paid with their lives. Communism was not created by the masses to overthrow the bankers. Communism was created by the bankers to overthrow and enslave the masses.
If you only look at those 10 years of post-revolutionary chaos and the Second World War, you could make the argument that people's lives got worse, but after that, evidence to the contrary becomes irrefutable. Hopefully you learned a few things from the series. If you noticed any errors, leave in the comments. Sources will be in the description and pinned comment. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.